Go.
Good evening. My name is Melissa Jane Rubin, and thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of the Miami Beach Chamber, President Jerry Libin, Robin Jacobs, our chairwoman, and myself, Magic City. In Disposable City, Miami resident Mario Alejandro Ariza shows us not only what climate change looks like on the ground today, but also what Miami will look like 100 years from now, and how that future has been shaped by the city's past and present. The book is an assemblage of perspectives from a political and residual and a residential views on how the diverse population will face flood damage, rising housing costs, dangerously high temperatures, and stronger hurricanes that not everyone will be able to pack and leave their homes. Disposable City is a thoughtful portrait of both a vibrant city with a unique cultural and a social, economic, and psychic of climate change that calls us to act before it's too late. So I'd like to also introduce our moderator tonight, Ronaldo Borges. He is an award-winning Miami-based international architect and a leader in sustainable and resilient design. As founder and CEO of the Borges Architects and Associates, a world-class architectural design and consulting firm, which marks its 20-year anniversary in 2020. His work ranges from mixed-use and commercial projects to office and hospitality and luxury residential design. In South Florida, he and his team are responding to a diverse set of needs and building types. The firm's expansive portfolio includes Infinity at Brickell, Aqua Blue, Megacentral Brickell, among others. With sustainability and resiliency at the heart of each of his acclaimed projects, Mr. Borges currently serves as chairman of the Resiliency and Sustainability Task Force of the Miami Beach Chamber and was appointed by Mayor Suarez as an advisor to the City Commission on sea level rise and resiliency initiatives, serving as a key member of the Resiliency Advisory Committee in the City of Miami. He is also active member of the Urban Land Institute, American Institute of Architects, and the U.S. Green Building Council. As a regular speaker on the topic of sea level rise and future-proofing cities from the effects of climate change, he was featured in Jeff Goodell's book, The Water Will Come, and his Emmy Award-winning documentary series featuring Jack Black entitled Years of Living Dangerously. Mr. Borges was originally born in Cuba and immigrated to the United States in 1969, where political strife threatened his and his family's well-being. After receiving degrees from the University of Florida, the University of Miami School of Architecture, and North Carolina State University, Mr. Borges went on to hold positions of design director in Architectonica, where he played an integral role in developing the existing skylines of Miami and Miami Beach. Having two incredibly knowledgeable guests this evening discussing our future, I know is going to be both engaging and informative. Remember, throughout tonight's broadcast, you are invited to ask questions by pressing the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can find Disposable City, and for that, in fact, any book that you might want to read, for purchase at Books and Books below by clicking the green button. Every purchase that you make supports Books and Books, and we do want to support our local bookstores. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Mario and Ronaldo.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for that intro. And, as I lead on the conversation with Mario, I wanted to thank Books and Books for the invitation. Obviously, it's a real privilege to have this conversation with Mario, who I've known for a while, and I've been observing his research and his intense dedication, to the content of this very important book. I think this book is a gift to our society. It's something that I really recommend we all read. I think part of the challenge of climate change is that we need to get educated. We need to understand how each of us individually are affecting the conditions that we are facing and how we could all make a difference. I have found the book to be super insightful. Obviously, it's I think it's the first book on this issue as it affects Miami that is written by a local a local individual that really has a love and a dedication to this community. So we can't really criticize Mario for being a foreigner or having ideas that are not really compatible with the local culture, the local geology, and the local condition that affects us. So I wanted to start by asking Mario, what was this inspiration, that really at one point, you sort of said, I have to write this book. Yeah. What was that moment in your life that you said, I have to dedicate myself like 3 years plus to all the research that you've done to really put this important book together for our community and actually for the international society? Because, as we know, it's not just Miami that's at risk, really. It's all coastal cities throughout the world that are at risk to sea level rise, and all the impacts of climate change, of course, affects many other locations throughout the world. So, Mario, what really gave you that sort of motivation to enter this journey that's resulted in this fantastic book?
Well, thank you, Reinaldo. And I want to start off by saying thank you to everybody for showing up tonight and for willing to hold space and discuss an issue that is gravely important to everybody here in the city. So sometimes you don't realize that you have a story within you until somebody else tells you. And the genesis of this book really came at an authors event called AWP, the Association of Writers and Publishers. And it was after a reading, and some editor at some press, I think it was Milkweed, and I were talking, and I was a little drunk, and I wouldn't shut up to him about the drainage system in Miami and how it wasn't going to function if the sea rose by 6 inches. And he was like, his eyes were glazing over a little bit. He wasn't really that interested. And I think he kind of told me, wait, you've got a book about this in you. And I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah. And I think this may have been his way of getting rid of me that evening, because I wouldn't shut up about it. And he told me, why don't you slap a book proposal together and send it to me? And I'm like, well, okay. I didn't even know what a book proposal was. This was 3-4 years ago. And I did. I put a book proposal together. I called my friend who was an agent. He helped me put it together. And in the act of putting it together, I sort of realized the gravity and the utility of writing a book about Miami, right? You have to put all this together in one place to explain it to people. And then hopefully people can use it to go from 0 to 100 on this issue as fast as they can.
Interesting. I mean, the book, in the sense of the depth that it has, what I see in that is that you've talked to everybody in the community that is involved on this topic. All the resiliency officers, public work directors, even politicians, of course, which are vital to our policy making. You really haven't talked to enough architects, in my opinion, but we'll talk about that later. I think that, it shows that you really did, the push-ups and the sit-ups, and you really understand the dynamics and the dangers that we face. And I think also I see it as a solution-focused approach. It's like something that you and I were discussing that, for those that look at this issue and they get overwhelmed, this is really, in my opinion, not a doom and gloom type of approach to what's going on. It's really an eye-opening book that really informs us of what's going on, and hopefully it leads to action, because that's what we need. We need people to take action. We know the power of the individual taking action, and especially in this format in the United States, is something that could really make a difference. So, I mean, you explored the Everglades, you explored Turkey Point, you've explored the river, the bay. It's like it's a super interesting context, that we live in, and it's a very sort of complex problem that we need to solve. And the questions become, how do we see solutions? So out of all this, and all this sort of depth of research and investigative work that you've done, what do you think are the biggest challenges that we face as a community in Miami? Let's keep it sort of localized.
Sure. A couple of things. So in terms of the complexity of the situation and the breadth of it, right? Like the challenge that I quickly realized that faced anybody trying to write about this was like how to tell engaging stories about what is essentially a really complex issue. which is why I went on a python hunt, which is why I went, on a leaky kayak up the Miami River with a friend of mine, and why I went and followed a lot of the stories. But in terms of the biggest challenges that the city face, I would put two in people's minds. One would be the lack of civic engagement that exists in Miami, right? I think it was Jorge Demian de la Paz, who is at the University of Miami, who said to me that Miami is one of the least civically engaged cities, if not the least civically engaged city in the country. And what do I mean by civic engagement? I mean people showing up to all of those not necessarily very well attended meetings of county or city government, people writing in and calling into their local politicians, people participating in the voting process, but not just voting, because voting is the bare minimum, right? It's people making their voice heard at all levels of the government. And why is the lack of civic engagement an issue when it comes to climate change? Well, it's simply because Miami, the political classes here don't necessarily see climate change as one of their top 5 big issues, right? If you talk to folks in the city of Miami government, they may tell you that, hey, look, we're worried about housing, we're worried about transportation, we're worried about COVID right now, right? But sea level rise may be like a 4th or a 5th, level concern. And if more people raise their voices about it, and if more people understand that climate change is the thread that ties all of these problems together, then some change may start to happen. That's the first issue. The second issue is the fact that your tax base is going to swiftly erode, and then your government won't be able to provide services to you, and then you're going to enter the death spiral, as I call it. And the death spiral is that really bad place that cities that are built to grow can get into if they start losing revenue and losing taxes, and that leads to cuts in services, which leads to lower tax bases and so on and so forth, right? And that's a very real possibility here. And it's one that isn't necessarily going to get fixed by building pumps, by hardening infrastructure, right? It's one that needs to get fixed with broad, deep conversations about, well, how do we tax and how do we send that taxable revenue and what services do we provide, right? And that's a conversation we're not necessarily having right now.
Yes. Yeah, so, the dynamics of how we're contaminating Biscayne Bay, how, we're managing or mismanaging South Florida, water management per se. All these issues are complex and concerning to all of us. We do have case studies. We look at Miami Beach as a case study of how city government has changed policy and invested now significantly in their infrastructure upgrades. I think that's pretty visionary and pretty out there. It has its critics, as you know, because my concern with the adaptation of the infrastructure is the fact that it's going to affect everybody. It's going to have a great concern of disruptive, actions throughout the community. Roads continuously being torn up and rebuilt and modified. These are things that Miami Beach has already lived through. And as you know, the community there sort of said, "Hey, let's stop this," and they've got this thing that they call the Great Pause now. And my involvement with Miami Beach, I've always sort of said, I think it's a mistake, to put the pause on this thing because sea level rise, climate change, the thing that is coming, that's affecting these coastal cities is not going to go away, right? So I think that you cover the concern that we have. The political will and the investment capacity to really do what we need to do in terms of a true adapted, holistic solution to this challenge of water, right? So in many ways, you sort of explore that in the book. You even when you describe your experience at your grandmother's party at the Jade condominium, and you're looking out into the bay. It kind of hits me, right? Because, as you know, because your mother is in real estate, what we sell here is the view, right? The view is like what sells best, and people want to come and connect to the water. And the water, which is a blessing for us in South Florida, is also our challenge here, because we're going to have more water than what we care to have. And we have it at both ends. You have it at the Everglades, and you have it on this Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. So, I think that the book really takes us through that journey, kind of understanding all of that complexity. And in terms of solutions, I would ask you, because you've sat through these long, boring meetings that we have in the Resiliency Committee, and you've talked to everybody involved in the adaptation, assuming that we had a blank check, that we could just write the check and invest and do what we need to do, where would you start? Based on this sort of understanding that you now have, where would you start with adaptation? How would you suggest that the community prioritizes the investment in adaptation?
This is going to sound a little radical, but it is, and this is my opinion. I think if I had a blank check, I would start talking to people about retreat, about really strategic, specific areas that it doesn't necessarily make sense to defend, right? And this may not be the business districts that we're talking about. These may not be the taxable, high net revenue areas, but people need to realize that there are going to be areas that have to be returned to nature and abandoned to the sea, and that costs a lot of money to do, right? And it's always sort of at the bottom of every ask. Like, we're not thinking about returning the neighborhoods that won't work to nature. What sort of benefits that may accrue to us, to the other neighborhoods that survive. So if I had the blank check, I would very much start having that conversation. There are also, radical interventions into the urban landscape that you have discussed and I've heard in other, forums that are really, really creative and also pretty radical too, right? Like if you look at what the Army Corps of Engineers is proposing doing here just to help keep Miami from being destroyed by a big storm surge during a hurricane, right? They're talking about 13-foot tall walls to become storm surge barriers and possibly a deployable barrier at the mouth of the Miami River, right? And that's a $4.6 billion price tag. So there are radical interventions that need to be changed. But if I had the blank check, I would try and change the discourse, right? I would try and make sure that everybody here understands what's going to happen and create enough political consciousness to get everybody understanding the basic science and the basic facts of what is going to occur here. Because from that consensus, we can dream the big dreams, right? And we can make the hard choices. And that's part of the reason why I've gone through the trouble of writing this book, because it is a vehicle for getting that consensus and that knowledge produced.
Do you think that the demographics of South Florida, the sort of the nature of the place, the fact that it's a community that in many ways is built and rebuilt by immigrants, and that perhaps the sense of place that South Florida has? I mean, I think in general in the United States, we become very transient, and someone that may say they were from Boston, well, they may now be living in Tampa, and
right.
They're no longer from Boston, but they still, follow sports and so on and so forth. But in South Florida, it's even hard to be a Dolphin fan nowadays because the Dolphins are not winning. So we are really spoiled in many ways. It is a hedonistic place, right? So this sort of concern of constant entertainment and pleasure, whether it's having a mojito or other things that people consume, the place really is affected by that in a way. And there's sort of like this attitude that we leave it to others to solve these difficult problems, and I just want to have fun. I want to go to a basketball game tomorrow night, enjoy, all these different entertainment venues that we have in South Florida. And in many ways that takes attention away from the real hard work of community work, of social justice issues, of policing issues, of sort of bringing balance, to the politics of the place. And in that sense, we're so distracted with so many opportunities to divert ourselves from hard issues, that are facing us, that perhaps you would find and agree that that's one of our challenges. It's sort of like we're so distracted by the place, which is so beautiful. I mean, we really are, blessed to be in a place that is so beautiful. But as I think you point out, with the increasing contamination of Biscayne Bay, and perhaps not taking effective action to really, change that around. You talk about the septic tank concerns. All the infrastructure concerns that you have are real concerns, right? So does it give you faith to know that the city of Miami right now is undergoing this stormwater master plan, and that soon we'll know what the blueprint is for that, what the price tag is for that, and how we phase into modifying the infrastructure of the city of Miami. What do you think about that?
So I take heart in a lot of the work that's been done over the past 15 years in adapting this area, right? In the spirited public servants who have sat down and had the difficult conversations and educated the political class here and brought community groups together and really shouldered a lot of that burden. And I'm really grateful for them and for the work that they've done, because in many cases they took the time to educate me about a lot of the issues and show me their perspective from within government, right? With that said, I'm glad the Stormwater Master Plan for the city of Miami is getting finished. And for those who don't know what a Stormwater Master Plan is, right? Let me just break this down real easy. It's going to start raining really, really hard, okay, because of climate change. The hotter things get, the more separation there is between the molecules in the atmosphere, the more moisture can be held between those molecules. The rains will come less often, less regularly, but when they come, they will come with a vengeance. And so your city has to change the way it drains its storm waters, because otherwise, even though you're up on the ridge and you're 17 feet above sea level, you may end up in, as we say, un charco, right? And you may be there for a while. And that's a huge process. It has to be mapped, it has to be planned, and Jane Gilbert has been shepherding this for a while. Jane Gilbert at the Resilience Office for the City of Miami. So it is heartening to hear that that this process is being done. However, and this story is in the Herald today, and it was broken by Joey Fletches and Alex Harris, and I'm glad they broke it. It appears that the budget for the Office of Resilience of the City of Miami has been zeroed out in the proposal for the next budget. And I have a lot of questions about that decision. I am going to find more information about that decision and attempt to relay it to the people who are curious and interested. I filed a records request this morning about it. And so, I will let you know more about that when I know more about that and have comment from the City of Miami. But, okay, we can finish the Stormwater Master Plan. But what does it mean if we're zeroing out the resilience office and not giving them a budget?
Yeah, so as you recount in your book, I mean, we had 3 resiliency officers, one in Miami Beach, one in Dade County, Jim Murley, and of course, Jane Gilbert in the city of Miami. At our last resiliency meeting, she announced that she was moving on. I didn't really get all the details from Jane yet, but I was learning today that her position is not being funded. So, right. It says a lot about a community, especially being led by a young mayor who is also sitting in a adaptation, committee that has global, international capacity and expertise. And he has a great opportunity to really bring best thinking, best solutions, best future-proofing strategies, and perhaps even best investment strategies to how we overcome this. It has to be something that gets faced, because the biggest concern with adaptation, and this is sort of the challenge for Jane or for Jim Murley or for Amy Knowles now in Miami Beach as resiliency officers, is really how to find the money to really invest in a long-term, step-by-step phased adaptation process and be consistent about it and be strategic about it and be serious about it. And whether it's at the county or at any of the municipalities, it's difficult right now, especially after this pandemic, to start to think that we're going to have the economic capacity, right, to do the effective investment into future-proofing the community, right? So that's a real game changer, and this has sort of been evolving as you wrapped up your book and as you got ready to release your book. So I think that if COVID would have been around, a bit earlier, you would have probably brought that into the conversation of the
possible shocks. Yeah.
And I want you to talk to us about your passion and your insight into how the social inequality, the social injustice that cities like Miami suffer are affected by climate. How did you venture into that connection, and what have you learned? How could we sort of deal with that crisis onto its own? Because those people getting displaced and neighborhoods are losing their heritage and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about that.
Right. So I guess, and to tie it into our previous discussion, why I'm worried about, or why I would love to hear more about the rationale for, not hiring resilience officers in the city of Miami again, or chief resilience officers, and subsuming the existing staff into the public's work department, is because even though I have my issues with this ideology of resilience, the ideology of resilience attempts to address both your hard infrastructure issues, right? Like, now you need a pump to drain the streets, and your soft societal problems, right? The fact that the workers who work in your hotels on Miami Beach have to spend 4 hours on the bus going back and forth because that's where the closest housing is, right? And that leads to transportation issues. When you have a pandemic, that leads to infection issues, right? So on and so forth, right? These issues compound. And so very quickly, when one begins to study the problems that climate change is going to cause to Miami, one comes to the realization that climate change doesn't just affect physical infrastructure, it affects the social networks that built that infrastructure. And when those social networks are already unequal, and when they already are perpetuating historical inequalities, then what climate change does is it literally turns the temperature up on those inequalities. And I'll give you an example. And this example was made very clear to me by Dr. Cheryl Holder at FIU, College of Herbert Wolfman Medicine. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one, Dr. Cheryl Holder. All right. So Dr. Holder works with patients that have COPD and asthma, and she does house calls. And where does she do these house calls? She'll do them in Little Haiti. She'll do them in Allapattah. She'll go to people's houses in Liberty City, right? And she noticed that because of the rising temperatures, right, and because of the lengthened allergy season, right, the mangoes are blooming in January now. That did not used to happen. And if you're allergic to that stuff, I apologize. Her patients were having worsening symptoms. And in addition to that, they all of a sudden were paying more for cooling their homes, right? Because the temperature was hotter. And so these people, their incomes hadn't gone up. They're seniors on a fixed income. But now they weren't able to run their AC as often, right? And add an environmental inequality to that. The fact that these neighborhoods don't have the same tree cover as, the very nice tree-lined avenues of Coral Gables, right? And you have a recipe for people with lung issues now on the high ground, which other people want to buy, who can't afford to cool their homes. Well, what does that mean? That means they're probably more willing to sell their house, okay? And that is leading to the gentrification of these neighborhoods. We do not have good data at the moment because sometimes we're not really good at collecting this kind of data on the number of people who don't have air conditioners in the city, or the number of people who can't afford to run their air conditioners often in the city. I would love to see that data, and I would love to see where they're concentrated. And I would love to see, what sort of policy options could be made to ensure that those neighborhoods, perhaps have some relief of that. And I know the city of Miami is trying to plant its 1 million trees. But that was an issue that very quickly reared its head when I was writing about climate change, and that is the issue of environmental justice, right? If you, I don't expect most people to know what a brownfield site is, so I'm gonna have to explain, okay? A brownfield site is as bad as it sounds, right? And as disgusting as it sounds. It's a brownfield. It's like soil that you don't want, right? It has heavy metals. If you're gonna build on it, it has to be remediated. Take a wild guess where all of the brownfield sites are, the vast majority of them within Miami-Dade County. They overlay almost exactly with the historical neighborhoods of color, right? And you ask yourself, why is that? Well, that's because when the city planners in the 50s and 60s were doing this sort of planning, the folks in those neighborhoods didn't necessarily have a voice in that process, right? And that leads to downstream effects. And that's an example of environmental injustice. Now throw in some extra flooding and then you have really, funky water in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these are critical issues that are also super important. I've been concerned that since we all seem to have limited attention spans, and limited ability to encompass all this mesh of complexity, and then how to formulate actionable items that could change policy and that could really start to improve how we see this future that comes towards us, in a slow way, because climate change, it sort of has erratic moments where things really change quickly, but it tends to be a very slow curve. And I get concerned that when you layer all these issues, right, social injustice, the displacement of people, related to climate impact, this sort of climate migration phenomenon that Jesse Keenan and Harvard and others have been looking at. It concerns me that you get to a point of paralysis where people just surrender and give up, and perhaps that's where you sort of say, well, your big idea is for people to start to have a plan to move to higher ground. And we've had through these years of a lot of community communication and discussion about this issue in the past, I would say the past 6 to 8 years, I've noticed more and more people from the outside. I remember a professor from Harvard sort of saying, why are you guys not talking enough about leaving? Why is there so much conversation about staying?
Right.
And I said, well, it's easy for someone from Boston to come down to South Florida and perhaps think that we should all be consumed about where we're going to move, where we're going to get displaced. And I think that serious consideration needs to be given to that displacement. But I'm also understanding the spectrum of or the complexity of how cities evolve and how populations shift. This will be historically the most transformative issue affecting coastal cities throughout the country, right?
For sure.
And to many degrees, these sort of 6 million people, more or less, that we have in the Tri-County right now, where do you move these people effectively, efficiently, in a way that makes sense? And what impact does that have on the current economy here? Because as you well document in your book, Miami's, I think, primarily is a touristic place. We don't manufacture much except condominium units, right? And in that sense, we need to continue to build. The economy here continues to thrive on reinventing the city. And my take, as a futurist architect and someone that dares to think about, staying and adapting this place, being hopeful that perhaps we could modify this place to look and feel in a way that we perhaps can't even start to imagine right now, but through the creative process, start to develop ideas and concepts that are phased and layered. I start to think of a layered city, a city that starts to elevate itself
Tell me about that.
in a phase format and allows the water to flow in, and we increase the capacity for water. Now, all of these things are very difficult to accomplish, based on current real estate dynamics and ownership of land and things like that. When people sort of start to say, well, let's carve a river out of Brickell Avenue and let Brickell Avenue, just have more water capacity. Well, that kind of so, the concern that I would say is sort of that master plan that we're now investing a lot of energy, because it's taken like 2.5 years to come to a stormwater master plan for the city of Miami by itself. When you implement it, you have to also have a little future glimpse of how the city will be in 50, 60, 100 years, and how much water could we really have the capacity to drain and to store and to displace. And what does that do, to the beautiful Biscayne Bay and to all the natural systems that are there, and also the beaches? We continue to have water quality issues here, and I think you point that out, that at a certain point, that may not be sustainable, that we may not be able to keep the water clean enough for this place to still be an attractive place. Is that a concern? That perhaps you would say, hey, that's serious. So water quality is prime. Protecting the quality of water.
Let's talk about water quality for a second, because I'm not sure if the lay audience is going to understand just how big of a problem Miami's poop is, right? Like first of all, I love talking about this stuff, right? Because I think it's kind of funny and sophomoric, but at the same time, it is a deadly serious issue, right? So for those who don't necessarily check the Surfriders Foundation water quality updates, weekly when they put it out, because I'm a surfer and I've gotten sick surfing from, bad water out on South Beach, right? Miami historically built a lot of septic tanks, okay? And they built it into a porous limestone soil. And a chunk of those septic tanks, there's about 120,000 parcels in Miami-Dade County. A good chunk of those are failing regularly, right? And during the rainy season, another larger chunk, about 50,000, according to Water and Sewer Department, will fail, right? And because of sea level rise, it's going to rise up to 60,000 within the next, I think it was 10 to 15 years. I might be wrong. And it costs about $3 billion or $4 billion, remind me if I'm wrong, about that amount of money to plug everybody on septic into sewer, okay? And you're like, well, wait, it's just poop in the water, dude, calm down. Okay, fine. But the nitrogen and the phosphorus from these septic tanks leaches into the Miami River, it leaches into the canals, and that goes to the bay. And if you look at the map and you see where's the seagrass dying off, where's the bay getting cloudy, where do you not want to swim? It's right at the mouths of these canals, okay? And I'm not the first one to say this, but if we lose the bay, we lose the reason why people want to come here and hang out, right? Because that azure blue-green bay that we love, that is, kind of on the cover of the book, right? It's going to be kind of murky green. It's going to look like a toilet bowl, right? And so this is an issue that has to be fixed. And it's one of the original developmental sins of the city when all those septic tanks got put in the 40s and 50s. So that's the water quality issue, right? And fixing that creatively and aggressively is one of the absolute prerequisites for this city getting its act together, I would argue. But sorry, you were going somewhere, and then I started talking about.
No, look, I mean, I think that, merging the conversation of the hard infrastructure of the city with the humanity and the social ills that we have is something that the book does very well. I just sort of sometimes I get concerned, because, it's almost like when you're trying to get a child to focus on something, you don't want to give them 5 big ideas because they get all confused and they don't know what actions to take. So it's like almost, the society, as you say, is not paying enough attention, right? There's not enough community engagement. Miami Beach is super engaged. People have opinions about everything, in Miami Beach, but that makes it very unique. And a lot of it has to do with protecting the architectural heritage of the place, as well as protecting, the lifespan of Miami Beach as a barrier island that has, incredible tax base. I mean, one of the wondrous things of Miami Beach is the fact that we do have a good tax base. And we've been talking a lot at the chamber, the business community, about how do we expand that? How do we bring a little bit more investment and more construction into the barrier island to continue to have a tax base? And right now, with the impact that COVID is having on the community, where the hotels basically empty and the lack of tourism, this is going to have a long-term impact, in terms of how we could continue to invest and reinvest in the way that we fortify and future-proof the community on the physical infrastructure side, on the affordable housing, on effective transportation, to move our workers around, all these things that are so important as well.
Yeah.
We'll continue to have deficits, that really allow us to solve those issues as well. Right now our firm is involved in affordable housing as well. And, the county has this sort of vision and projection to build about 90,000 affordable housing units in a relatively short period of time. But if you really understand the process and the labyrinth of process to accomplish those 90,000 units, which we need like active tomorrow, right? We there's no time to spare. That's a big concern that we're not efficient enough in delivering those units to bringing, affordability into the residential market.
Right.
It's difficult to talk about affordability when, we're selling, $50 million condominiums and people keep on coming and investing in that, right?
Well, Reinaldo, let's make the link between affordable housing and climate change, right? In Miami, right? Why should somebody who lives in Kendall or lives in South Miami or lives in a nice part of North Miami care about the lack of affordable housing and this like possibly amorphous issue called climate change, right? And the link is pretty concrete, okay? If housing is really expensive here, right, more new housing is going to get built. And where is that new housing being built because of the way the city's master plans have been developed, right? Because of how the city has been planned, it's being built on some of the lowest, most vulnerable ground. It's being built in Homestead, right? A place where if it floods at 2 feet above sea level, if we get 2 feet of sea level rise, Homestead is going to have a lot of issues, right? And so you're seeing a lot of affordable housing, a lot of low density affordable housing being built over there, right? And it may not survive an entire mortgage cycle, to be frank with you, okay? But, okay, some people are going to end up buying houses in vulnerable areas and they may lose generational wealth and, you know, okay, well, whatever. That's not a big deal. But think about the commute that these people have to take, right? If you have to go from, and the people in West Kendall understand this intimately, right? If you have to go from West Kendall to Doral or West Kendall to Weston to work, right? You have to do that. The amount of carbon that you're going to put into the atmosphere just getting to work, and this isn't a pre-COVID time, right, is vastly larger than if we had dense, transit-oriented, affordable housing units, right? If we, I don't know, passed a workforce housing development or amendment and told developers that when they had to build within the unit or within the site a certain amount of workforce housing, right? And so that's a policy change that, you know, as we say in Santo Domingo, eso no te cuesta. That's free. But have we decided to make that? We haven't. More importantly, though, right? Like, you got to look at the crises as opportunities. So COVID is awful, and we're in the barrel right now, right? We're one of the hot spots in the entire world, and you know, hey, it's terrifying, right? I'll be the first one to emote with everybody on this. This is scary stuff, okay? But there are opportunities here that creative policy and political leadership could take advantage of, right? Look, we're doing this from home now. Did we spend any carbon or a lot of carbon to have this conversation? No, right? And so how do you think about solidifying the greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the Miami area that we have accrued because we're all working from home now? How do we take as much of that as we can and make that permanent, right? That's a discussion that could be pretty game-changing for a place like Florida or South Florida, because we really do emit a lot of carbon here, right? But, you know, we're not necessarily seeing the crisis as an opportunity as well.
Well, so, you know, I in this journey of educating myself and becoming more and more active and aware of what I could do, particularly with my practice and through my voice with this issue, I've also learned that there are different priorities. You know, you have to kind of prioritize the strategy, right? And, you know, in many ways, the scientists will tell you there's so much heat already, you know, baked into the system. There's so much thermal expansion in the ocean. There's so much ice melting, and that process is really going, and sometimes it really accelerates. That, you know, the focus should be on adaptation. Like, you know, the water is coming, right? And when it comes, are we ready for it, right? And to some degree, some would say, well, don't worry so much about the carbon issue at the moment, even though we know that we're in deep trouble when it comes to carbon. We continue to consume carbon like champions. You know, the United States is really the #1 consumer of carbon compared to countries that have, you know, greater population, right? Because we all feel like we need to have our, you know, individual vehicles and
per capita, we are #1.
Exactly. So it's like, you know, we need to focus on all of these things, right? But you know, in order to accomplish something, I think we need to have focus. And I think that I would ask you, you know, if you were to recommend to our friends and families in this community, what are the 5 actions that you think individuals need to start taking to really make deep, you know, impact on how we prepare for this future and even for the present? You know, what are those 5 actions that you would recommend to our friends and families in the community?
Sure. And I would just say, as a working journalist, recommending that people take sort of actions like crossing the line between editorial and news. But I'm going to take the hat off and say that the following statements are my personal opinions about what you can do, right? So here's my personal opinions about what you can do. And they are layered. And you're going to be like, well, why are you starting there? But I'm going to start with your personal actions, right? Your personal choices. And you need to look at the way that you live your lifestyle, and you need to reduce as much of your carbon consumption as possible. drive less, eat less meat, do your part, right? It's just like wearing a mask, okay? Now, you can't stop there, right? You have to go out and you have to find your people, right? You've gotten educated on the issue. You've read my book. You've read a bunch of other books. You've reduced your carbon consumption. You have to find like-minded people, right? And you have to engage in a civic life here, right? Because what saves us isn't necessarily one specific policy. It is creating a civic culture that is strong enough to have a robust exchange of ideas, interpersonally, right? To create that trust. The third one is getting really informed and getting really cozy with your local legislators, right? And you're like, wait, I thought we were solving for climate change. I didn't know that I was going to have to call my commissioner or my alderman every week. Call your commissioner or your alderman every week, okay? The people who get stuff done in city government are the ones who are the most absurdly annoying and the ones who will not drop an issue. And I see this time and time and time again as I pour through records requests, okay? Steps 4 and 5 are a little amorphous, and they're going to be policy recommendations. You need to get educated about your state's energy policy, okay? And you're like, wait, my state has an energy policy? Yeah, your state has an energy policy, and its energy policy is essentially burn natural gas, right? And Florida emits as much greenhouse gas as Malaysia, which has about 3 times the population. And the reason why we do is because the lights that are powering all of this right now come from fossil fuels. That needs to alter rapidly. And the faster that changes and the faster we mitigate, the less adaptation we're eventually going to have to do. And then that gets to number 5, which is that you have to become knowledgeable about the adaptation that your area needs, right? Which means that you need to become knowledgeable about your own vulnerability. Is your house in a place that's going to flood? Okay. What's the likelihood of your house flooding in a major storm in the next 30 years? There are places on the internet that'll tell you that for free. They'll give you a flood IQ of your property. How do you prepare for that, right? So your personal vulnerabilities, and then figure out, wait, can my area be adapted? What are the adaptations there? If we put a pump here, what would that do? Are there blue-green, infrastructure opportunities here? What I mean by blue-green infrastructure, I mean mangroves. I mean ways of like filtering sewage that don't necessarily involve connection to a sewage plant. So those are, sort of amorphous, but those are the 5 recommendations that I would make. But I don't know, maybe you have some to add as an architect.
Well, so, yeah, you don't want to get me there. My wife is not close enough to kick me under the table. So, look, you've really made this link between climate and social justice and all the other things that challenge us in that spectrum. You're young, soon starting a family. I have daughters. I have young, members of the family that are starting their family as well. Does it give your generation right now some hesitation in terms of, this is a tough question, bringing children, to this sort of world that we have, the challenges that we face? Or are you an optimist and you're saying, yes, I want to bring them in and they're going to be part of the solution and they're going to enjoy this beautiful world and this beautiful life and contribute, to something positive in this society? So
I wrote this book for my kin, right? Like if you go to the dedication, it's dedicated one to Catherine Stein, because I'm madly in love with her. And then it's also dedicated to the great-grandchildren of Ani Baez de Guerra, who is my grandmother, and these are my cousin's kids, right? And they're the ones who are going to inherit the city. I don't know if I'm going to have kids. I don't know. Life is weird, right? We'll see where it goes. But I know that I need to fight for them, right? And that I need to stand up what I can stand up against the coming of the tide. And what I can stand up is a book, right? I can put words together, I can tell stories, and I can make them stories kind of funny, right? Like life pro tip, don't go python hunting when you're hungover, right? Read about that in here. But that's what I can contribute, and everybody will contribute what they can. And the decision to bring a child into the world is a tough one. But I do feel a degree of optimism that like we can fix this, right? And that's the through line through the book. Miami has a narrow golden path to survival. It really does. For them to tell you, or for anybody to tell you that this city is absolutely doomed, is factually inaccurate. because there are things that people here can do, and there are things that people around the world can do to make sure that Miami survives, right? And
we have about 50 minutes to wrap up, and there are 4 questions that have come in. So I'm going to give you the first question here. So, can you touch on how our local economy plays into the discussion about resilience and climate adaptation? That's one question. Miami's economy is almost entirely dependent on foreign investment, luxury housing, and tourism. And we can see how vulnerable that is and disruptive right now. How can we transform our economy along with our infrastructure? And that question comes from Lee Weston.
Cool, Lee. That's a great question. Okay, so sometimes I feel like it's a cop-out to talk about the Dutch model. Other times I feel like it's actually instructive, right? And what I mean about the Dutch model is that if you look at Holland, Holland has basically figured out how not to drown, right? Sorry, my hair looks funny. Anyways, and B, how to make a lot of money off of teaching other people how not to drown, right? They get 2% of their GDP from selling adaptation services, engineering services. Do I think that Miami's economy, with the beaches and the foreign investment and the party, listen, the pachanga is going to stop. The party is going to stop at some point, right? And our job here is to envision an economy based off of products and services that don't require that, or that can supplant that as it goes away, right? Selling and learning how to adapt and selling that knowledge is one way to do it. We're also, we're running our economy off of one engine right now because the port, it's not much is leaving in terms of cruise ships. But what's keeping our economy going in terms of cargo? The airport. We have the largest cargo airport in the world here in Miami International. The gateway for cargo shipment. And so our capacity to transform the city's economy into a logistics hub and to really double down on that aviation is listen, we were made possible because of the airplane, and we're going to have to rely on it going forward. So there are ways to adapt this economy, but again, it takes far-sighted leadership and statesmanship.
Another question is asking, could you talk about the managed retreat vis-a-vis elevation? Some of the highest ground in Miami, of course, is historically Black communities. I guess somebody's referring to Little Haiti and perhaps the Bahamian village in the Grove. This has attracted development projects and gentrification, of course. I found that this is to be a blind spot of resilience rhetoric. It does not account for those unforeseen consequences and disruptions in the social landscape caused by climate adaptation. Culture diversity has been a major selling point for Miami, and these processes fundamentally alter the city's character. So it's it's both a question and a statement that is making.
Well, no, I think it's a great question, and it is one of the serious criticisms that I level at the rhetoric of resilience, and one of the main reasons why I think that if you're going to solve for climate change, you have to solve for inequality at the same time, right? You cannot confront the processes that put all the carbon into the atmosphere without acknowledging that those processes were themselves exploitative in a racial way, right? So what does that mean in terms of Miami? It means that we need to figure out a way to save and share the high ground, okay? I don't know what that sharing is going to look like, but I know that we're not really doing a good job of it right now. And I in the book, really take pains to document the story of the Magic City Innovation District and the fight that the Haitian community had, or that parts of the Haitian community had, to be most accurate, against that particular development. And if you don't know the story, it's in the book. But suffice to say, this was a large development that was marketed as a climate safe development because it was on the high ground. Was there workforce housing to be built with that development? Was that development going to destroy sections of Little Haiti and alter the character of the neighborhood, and also make the folks who are being displaced much more vulnerable? Quite possibly, So that's still going on, and it's not just the big developments; it's 1,000 little cuts of the house flippers coming in, and that's in there too. I can document that process, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of advocates who are working on it. But in terms of answers, there's a suite of policy choices there.
Yeah, and I lived through that whole process and went to many of the hearings. And of course, as an architect, I always believe in progress. And I thought it was progress. I thought it was a carefully thought through project, but it does have is concerns. And I think the developer made a gesture of contributing over $31 million to the community, which is really significant money. And still, there's a lot of concern. But in general, the complexity of that topic is that on the one side, you would agree that we need to elevate our tax base by reinvestment, by innovating, through developments, right? Through housing developments, through mixed-use developments. And at the same time, sometimes when a visionary developer comes in with a project like that is sort of carving into a neighborhood that has, that history of the Haitian immigration into Miami, even though most of the parcels that they're developing are vacant, and most of the parcels that they're developing are not really displacing anybody. Still, the criticism was that the nature of the project was going to have an impact on displacing people, on elevating rents, making the neighborhood more expensive. Now, for those that sort of see gentrification as something positive that happens to communities, because it's really a natural process in American real estate impact on communities, there's a lot of studies that say that gentrification really could have a lot of plus impact on cities like Miami and the neighborhoods that are being impacted. So that's a complex and long conversation. We have a question from a gentleman, Warren.
Yeah, and I would challenge some of those statements very respectful. But yes.
Yes, I'm sorry.
It's okay, go.
We have a few more minutes here. There's a gentleman from London who is asking, do you think that large numbers of tourists are part of Miami's climate change problem or part of the solution?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. We can ask them when they decide to come back after the pandemic is over, if they come back. No, they'll be back. And some of them are still here because I can see them.
Well, I mean, so if you understand the economic dynamics of tourism in South Florida,
right,
and that here we don't manufacture cars, we don't manufacture rockets, we
right,
manufacture basically great experiences. We have a great beach, great architecture, great mixed culture.
And can you do that in a low carbon future, right? Does it make sense to put people on planes and ship them over here and put all that carbon into the atmosphere? Does it make sense to have cruise ships that are literally burning bunker fuel 7 at a time, parked at the port of Miami, just putting more and more CO2 into the atmosphere?
Indeed, but right?
Are
Now COVID
we even going to have a beach in 30 to 40 years, right?
It's a scary idea, okay, that in order to solve climate, aviation stops, cruise ships stop, transportation, gets impacted. It has a very positive impact on our carbon footprint and on sort of the planet recuperating from all the damage. But look at what it does to the economics. I mean, the economics of Miami Beach will be long impacted by what's going on today and what's going to go on probably for over a year now as we try to open up Miami Beach. I mean, it's a difficult issue, and I tell you that the political leadership in Miami Beach is really having a hard time, thinking through this at the moment, because balancing the budget, it's not just Miami Beach, it's the county, Dade County that has over 35 municipalities, trying to really make the balancing of the books when you have basically paralysis on the tourism side, and those dollars are vital for this community. They do get reinvested into a lot of different projects. So I think it's, yes, if you want to be in utopia and you want to say, yeah, let's stop aviation, and it's amazing how COVID has done that very well. But at the same time, that mobility and the fact that people come here from everywhere, it's been part of the economic dynamics of this place.
Well, a pandemic is in some senses a vision of the future, right? Because there's going to be a point where if we don't get this right, people aren't going to want to come here. And we're going to have to figure out what to do without all those flocks of tourists. But in biology, there's this idea, okay? Every ecosystem has a biological limit. There's only so many resources in a given ecosystem. And when the ecosystem reaches that biological limit, the organisms in there either have to adapt or that ecosystem loses complexity, okay? COVID is teaching us what a biological limit is the hard way. right? And the questions that we maybe should be asking isn't necessarily, hey, how do we do this without tourists? How do we do this without, how do we make money without tourists, right? How do we grow our GDP without people coming here for this experience of putting all that carbon into the atmosphere? But one question may be, how do we provide without those tourists coming back, right? How do we make sure that there isn't hunger? How do we make sure that people are housed? How do we make sure that there is equitable justice and safety in this area that we have, right? With the resources that we have here without folks coming in or out? Because that's the question that we're being posed by this historical moment. And it sounds like a crazy question. It sounds like a utopian society. Like, Mario, what are you proposing, right? Eso es socialismo. Okay, fine, maybe, but nobody's coming here for a while. So think about it, you know? Yes. Because until there's a vaccine, you know, what, you're going to sit in your house and watch Netflix? Or you could pick up a book.
Yeah, I have a good idea for a book. So Raquel, North Bay Village, is asking, coming from a small city with tremendous potential but declining property values, where an urban island paradise in the middle of the bay, this is North Bay Village, which is between Miami and Miami Beach, as we know. How can we avoid the death spiral of declining property values? And those are things that you discuss in your book, you know, and that's sort of the big question here in terms of the real estate dynamics and investment in South Florida. If you could prioritize adaptation for us, what would you say?
That's a fascinating question. I would say that you have to get really creative and think through what your city is, right? We have this kind of urban federalism here in Miami, right? We have 36 small cities or large cities under the county government, right? And maybe what is a very adaptive way of thinking about it is, instead of just, you know, North Bay Village fighting the rising tide on its own, maybe it joins with Surfside and Golden Beach and it pools its resources and its tax base, right? And maybe you have a merger of certain services and service delivery. And okay, yes, you lose some autonomy, but you know, some of those towns are really small to begin with. Personal opinion. In terms of adaptation, I mean, there are folks who tried to start in that part of town retreat funds. They wouldn't call it a retreat fund, but they started trying to put money away for eventually having to move away, in acknowledgement that you know, either live on infill or that you live on a piece of barrier island that wasn't there 4,000 years ago because it's essentially sand, right? And that it's not going to be there forever. So that's one adaptation that I think should be discussed more thoroughly and should be planned more thoroughly. And that there may be ways of kind of codifying it within county charters or within city charters.
Yeah, I think that you know, to sort of add to that idea of codification, that gets into changing policy. Like, changing policy is so important to really bring, I think, stability and confidence in the investment that people are making in the coastal areas, even in the suburban areas. And I think that, again, you know, going back to understanding how the tax base allows us to survive and for communities to balance their books, I think we need to be careful in terms of sort of thinking that, you know, displacement, you know, sort of having a game plan to move to higher grounds is significant now, because, you know, we know that the incremental aspect of sea level rise is something that happens slowly, right? So this is not like, you know, honey, pack the car, let's move.
Right, we gotta go
next month, right? So what people have to have an understanding is that, you know, depending on your lifespan and how long you're going to live and your investments and what you want to do with that real estate investment, it really affects your game plan on how you plan to either stay and adapt or to move to higher ground. And those are personal issues that people are going to have to make. I think we're wrapping up here, and I want you to make a few final comments. I do want to encourage everyone to buy a copy of the book. It's not just a pretty cover, it's an amazing book, and it's very transformative to the way we understand this dilemma and how we hopefully could take action and bring the individual into this issue, which is so important in the policy making. And that's really how the politician gets motivated to take action on this. So Mario, give us your final words.
Thank you. Thank you, Reinaldo. Listen, my final word is just one of gratitude, right? I didn't think that this book was going to get picked up in the way that it did. I didn't think that this many people were going to read it. I didn't think that this was going to start the conversation that it has. it's already a measure of how people are concerned and the depth of that concern that the book has had the success that it has already. And so I want to thank everybody who made this possible. And also I want to say that, this book is designed to empower you to make the right choices for yourself and for your city. And I really hope it does that in an entertaining way. And that if I got anything wrong, let me know and I will correct it in the second edition.
Well, great. Buy your copy of Books and Books, by the way. Thank you to Mitch and the Books and Books family.
Yes.
And for all of those that joined us this evening to enjoy, I think, this conversation. It really is critical for our future. And I thank Mario again for taking the action to write this book with the seriousness and the dedication that he has brought forth. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Reinaldo, for a spirited discussion. I always love talking with you, man.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Have a good evening, everyone.